So the first question, what makes a good research paper? To start with, a good paper is a paper that will alter the weight of the evidence on some issue that's important. So I'm assuming we're talking about observational studies here, and observational studies, no single study will prove or disprove causality or show something definitively, but each study contributes to the weight of the evidence. And so when we get new papers, I actually think of the weight of the evidence like a normal distribution. So,
Yeah.
So a paper about a topic where there's no information at all, like the bold curve on the bottom, where there's very little information, and then something that adds to the weight of evidence would be like the red curve or the blue curve. So they may be finding the same thing, but they are making the evidence for it much stronger. Whereas the green curve, which is off to the left, is something that shifted the weight of the evidence. So we're looking for papers that can change the weight of the evidence, either shift it or add to it. So again, a confirmatory study. So a study that repeats something that's been shown elsewhere can strengthen the weight of the evidence. A study with a new design can shift it, and then also something that provides new insight. But the issue that's being addressed has to be important. So is it something that's addressing a key gap in information, an important public health issue, something that affects a lot of people, or maybe affects a small number of people, but very seriously, and information that's needed to motivate change, so changes in policy, for example. So what gives an individual study weight? So what is going to make it so that it adds to the curve or moves the curve? The first thing is that it's got to be well conducted. So a study design and data and analysis that can address study questions. No study is perfect. All studies have limitations, right? So we know that. But hopefully the limitations are going to be offset by strengths and other aspects of the contribution. And then you really don't, the worst thing is a study that has a fatal flaw. So a fatal flaw is something that's inherent in the study design that you can't correct after the study is done. So you can't fix it by adjusting the data analysis. So a study with a serious fatal flaw is going to have very little weight, even if the study question is important. The quality of the writing and presentation are important. So an incomprehensible paper can't be evaluated. So if we can't understand the paper, we can't determine if it adds weight or not. The other thing that we worry about, if a paper is very sloppy, if there's a lot of errors, if it seems to have been done very hastily, then we worry that the study itself may be sloppy, may be poorly conducted. We also need enough information so that we can evaluate the study. So that the information needs to be clear and very complete and also unbiased. We need enough information about the methods so that, so that someone could repeat the study, at least in theory, right? So you can never repeat the study in the same population at the same time, but so that somebody could do the same thing.
Please, where is recording here?
Hello? Okay. And then enough information so that readers—
Please, could you stop the video? Could you stop your video, please?
Okay.
For the quality of your video and your microphone. Stop it, please.
Hello?
Yeah, we hear you.
Am I okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So a lot of people worry about whether a paper is, or a study is novel, or if it's the first study to ever show something. And this could be an issue if you're doing a confirmatory study. So often papers from low and middle income countries are repeating something that's been done someplace else. Is that a concern? And again, since no single study can prove or disprove causality, it's not a bad thing to be confirming other results because you're helping contribute to the weight of the evidence. The other thing is that the first study to report a brand new finding is often the last study to report it. So novel findings are often spurious. Okay, so that's just a really brief overview of what makes a paper good, and this is something that applies to any paper. And now I'm going to talk a little more specifically about how you can increase your likelihood of publication in an international journal. And the things I'm going to say here are actually also true of any paper. But in the case of papers, and papers coming from Africa specifically, journal editors are highly motivated to publish studies of underrepresented populations and issues and populations relevant to low and middle income countries. And I guess this is not true of all editors, but most of us, we really want to publish these papers. We want to do it, I mean, first of all, because we want to do the right thing. These are important public health issues, often with wide impacts. You know, and it also helps increase our geographic range and audience. So these are papers that we want to publish. Well, okay, so why don't we publish more of them? What are the barriers from the journal's point of view? And one thing that we have to consider, and this is true of papers from anywhere. So again, this is not necessarily papers from Africa or LMICs, but is the potential impact of the paper going to be consistent with the journal's expectations? So is it going to contribute to the weight of the evidence? Will it be cited? So citations, you guys are probably familiar with the journal impact factor, but this is just, it's basically a measure of the average number of citations per year for papers published in the previous 2 years. This is not the most important thing. It's not the only thing that we think about, but it's a metric that everybody uses. And one thing that makes a journal a desirable place to publish is having a higher impact factor. So if we take papers that we think will have much lower citations than the norm, we have to be willing to accept the fact that these papers will, in bulk, pull our impact factor down, and then we become a less interesting journal for you guys to publish in. But we also think about, you know, what's the potential impact on policy, public health, and global health? Again, you know, we do have those bigger, more important interests at heart as well. So what makes you know, what are we thinking about in terms of potentially low impact papers? So again, confirmatory studies. So in many cases, papers that we receive from Africa and elsewhere may be repeating findings that have been done in other populations. This doesn't make them unimportant, right? But it can lessen the impact. Also local issues with local implications. Now, if it's a very, very specific local issue to an area, then it's not going to have wide interest to readers. And then studies may be limited because of lack of resources. So they may be very small or have limited data. Again, these apply to all papers. Another thing to consider is the amount of effort that will be required to meet journal expectations. So we also have limited resources that we can provide. So will we have to do more copy editing? Will the editors have to spend more time? Will a paper require more rounds of reviews? So these are things that we have to weigh against our desire to publish more papers. So what can you do? What can authors do to tip the balance in their favor? And I'm just going to go through 4, I think, high-level things. There's a lot more I could talk about, but I tried to think of the things that would be most important. And the first is picking the right target journal. So take a look at the journal aims and scope. So on a website for every journal, they should have someplace a statement of their aims and scope, and make sure that the topic that you have covered in your study is covered by the journal. The other thing is journals will actually have statements about what are priorities for them. So they may have specific priorities to publish from underrepresented areas, from LMICs. And then has the journal published studies like yours? So look at the kinds of papers they publish. Look at the sources that you cite. Are they published in the journal? And thinking about, again, is the potential impact consistent with the journal's expectations? Now you should aim high. So, you know, write the best paper, do the best study you can, and aim for a high journal. Don't automatically go to a journal that you're certain that you can get published in. At the same time, you should be realistic because you will lose time. So the more selective the journal is, the more likely it is that they will reject your paper without review, so a desk reject. And the nice thing about that is it's fast, but you usually don't get any feedback at all, or you may just get a little bit of feedback. So if you go from journal to journal to journal, you could lose a lot of time. Think about, is your paper appropriate for the journal's audience? So now you've picked a target journal. Now you need to write the paper to be a good fit for that journal. Things that we see, sometimes papers will be written in a way that's much too basic for our audience. On the other hand, some other journals or papers are written so that they're much too advanced. They're full of jargon and we don't understand them. So you want to find the level that's a good fit for the journal. The methods and approaches also consistent with the norms for the journal. So even the same study question may be addressed using very different methods. So in a social science journal, for example, compared with an epidemiology journal. And if you're aiming for a multidisciplinary journal, sometimes that's less of an issue, but still you want it to be a good fit. So for example, in EHP, there's certain social science methods that we don't publish very often, and you might be better off going to a different journal for that. And then thinking about the philosophy of the journal. So every journal has sort of philosophies about interpretation or inference. And the place that this comes up most often is in relation to the statistical significance testing. So if you look at journals, some journals prohibit any mention of statistical significance. Other journals, maybe in the same discipline, will prohibit you from reporting results that aren't statistically significant. And so, you know, if there's extremes like that, you want to be in the right place. You want to be in a journal that fits your philosophy about it, and you want to write your paper to fit that journal's philosophy. That can be hard to find. Sometimes journals will have editorials about these things, but a lot of times you just need to look at the papers that are published in your target journal and see what they do. Journals have different requirements and standards, so sometimes they have very strict reporting requirements. For example, EHP requires that all results be reported in full, even if it's just a sensitivity analysis. Other journals would do the opposite, so they would say, we don't want results reported that are sensitivity analyses. So you want to look at that. Do they require checklists? And then thinking about the quality of writing and presentation. Now this is actually important for any journal. It doesn't matter where you publish. You want to make sure that your paper is as well written and presented as possible. So consider having somebody copy edit your paper for grammar and word use. You know, I think everyone in this group speaks English, some people as a first language, some people as a second language, but even the way in which people speak English varies. So unfortunately, Americans are probably the worst English speakers in the world, and they expect everybody to speak English the way they do. So you might even want somebody to look at it who is from America. If it's going to an American journal, it would be different for a British journal or a European journal. The other thing that I can't recommend enough is before you submit a paper to a journal, get as much feedback as you can from peers. So get your friends to read it, get your co-authors to read it, get people from outside your research area to look at it if possible, and try to get them to be honest with you and give you real feedback. That can be incredibly important. And again, this is true of any paper. Okay, what if your paper gets rejected after it's reviewed? Well, first of all, congratulations that you got reviewed by the journal and didn't get desk rejected. But when this happens, it's really, really important. So you'll need to go to another journal. It's really important to revise your paper in response to the reviews that you got, even though it got rejected. So don't just take the same paper and send it to a different journal. First of all, the reviews that you got will improve the paper. So if you respond to them, it will be a better paper. Second, the other journal may use the same reviewers. We see this a lot where we get reviewers and they'll say, I already reviewed this for another journal. And the authors didn't pay attention to the things I said before. So I have the same review that I did last time. And then it's also important, you need to be prepared to revise your paper for the next target journal. So again, it's going to have a different emphasis on methods or different priorities. You should redo your paper as needed to fit the next target journal. And that's where, you know, in the first journal and just plan to go from journal to journal to journal, there is work involved in that. Okay, the next thing is to convey the importance of your paper. So convey the importance of the contribution. And I think this will be important to people in this group. And the places where you do that, the cover letter, the title, the abstract, the introduction, the discussion and conclusion. So I'm skipping over a lot of important parts of the paper. But I think editors don't get a clear sense of why something is important, and so they end up rejecting that review. The title, I don't want to go into too much. Titles vary from journal to journal. So this is something where some journals want very detailed titles, very descriptive titles. Some journals encourage authors to state their conclusion. Remember, this is the first thing that the editor sees. So you want the title to be consistent with the expectations for the journal. And it's really important, avoid puns and wordplay, avoid questions, because, you know, you don't want an editor's first impression of your paper to be something that makes them laugh. You want them to take it seriously. And this is a classic example of why a question is bad. So the title of this paper is, can a parent superluminal, I won't even read it, but it's a question. And then the abstract says, probably not, right? So that's a good example of why you want to avoid questions. What about the cover letter? So the cover letter is a good opportunity for you to explain to the editor why the paper is appropriate for their journal and what it adds to the literature. Now be careful, editors don't always read cover letters, so you can't rely on it. Some journals don't even provide you an opportunity to submit a cover letter. But if they do, this is a place for you to help explain why your paper is important. Now don't overhype it, don't overstate. You don't want to promise to deliver more than you really can, because editors will see that. They'll see that you're overdoing it, and that will give them a negative impression. The abstract is also really important to convey the importance of your study. Again, this is part of the first impression. So the background and the objectives. Now, even if the journal doesn't have structured abstracts with subheadings, I strongly encourage you to write it in a structured way. So start with a background that motivates the study, why the problem that you're addressing is important, and where the missing pieces are that you're going to fill in. And then your objective, one or two lines, clearly states what your study is going to do, what it, the question that you're trying to address. So these should be very brief, but they're very important. The discussion and conclusion section of the abstract is also important. So a clear summary of the major findings and conclusions and what your study adds to the evidence. Again, you don't want to overstate what you actually found. You probably not proving anything. You're probably not doing something. The most of the abstract addresses methods and results, but again, these are the sections where you can really convey the importance of your study. The introduction is also important. So really the whole point of the introduction is to motivate your study. It should have a very standard structure. So typically it moves from very broad, so you start with the big picture that helps you frame why your study question is important. And then you move through the introduction to end on how you address the question that you have shown is important. I won't go through the individual parts of the introduction in time, but it needs to be just very clear, you know, why the exposure is important, who's at risk, how often are people at risk, or how big is the population, what are the data gaps, and again, you want a very clear statement of the aims and how you address them. Avoid hyperbole. Avoid quotes. Sometimes people like to get very lofty and quote famous people. This should be very business-like and clear. And also convey the importance in the discussion section of the discussion and conclusions. So this is where you explain what you're studying, the weight of the evidence. So its structure is kind of the opposite of the introduction, where you usually start by restating your study, what you did, your major findings. Then you talk about those findings in the context of existing knowledge, and then you move back and you repeat what your main findings are. Again, this is just an outline of the parts of the discussion, and I think I'll skip the details here. We can talk about them more. But the concluding paragraph, again, is really important because you're again saying what you contributed to the weight of the evidence. And in all cases, you know, I'm telling you how important it is to convey the importance of your study, but you need to do that in a way that's honest and realistic and clear. It doesn't work if you try to make it seem more important than it really is. And this is where it can be really helpful to get feedback from your peers, because you know, we do studies and we're so invested in our studies and we really love our studies and we do them because we believe in them. And sometimes it's hard to be sort of realistic about how big the contribution really is. So it might help to get some realistic feedback from your friends. You know, is this the most important study ever done? Probably not. But what is important about it? And that's what you need to convey. So I just wanted to mention specific studies because, again, these may be studies, these are studies that we often see from Africa and LMICs in general, and in particularly confirmatory studies. So repeating something that's been done in the US or in Germany or in China maybe, but in a different setting. These are really important studies. For one thing, you often need local confirmation to spur government action, to spur changes in policy. And it's okay to convey that information. You know, why this is important, because this information will help inform an important policy decision. Another thing is that even if you found the same thing, but in a very different population, this adds a lot to the weight of the evidence. So if you have a finding same
Thank you very much.
in
Sir?
one country,
No, it's because everybody.
then that adds a lot.
Everybody.
And then contrasting findings. So what if your finding is very different? So you find something in your country or your location that's very different from what's been found in Europe or North America. Well, this can indicate really important susceptibility factors and reinforces how important it is to have local confirmation of studies. So the key here is that if your findings are very different, your study has to be done in a way that makes people feel confident that your findings are different because your population or your setting is different, not because your findings are spurious because your study was too small or used the wrong approach. And then what about the idea of local issues with local implications? Well, the thing here is, first, the magnitude of the implications for your quote unquote local population can be very large. These things can be really important in terms of environmental equity and justice. You may have a local issue in your country that is driven by market demands in developed countries. So if people are doing artisanal mining, well, that may be a local problem, but it's caused by a global force. And so that is a really important problem, and it's legitimate to bring that out. A lot of times a local problem may be very relevant to other regions. So within Africa, Africa is a big place. I don't need to tell you guys that. Other low and middle income countries, there may be relevance well beyond that. And so bring that out, think about what that could be. And then implications for developed countries and global effects. And actually, I think, we're seeing a lot now where, something that started in China is now affecting the whole world. So we know now that everything is global at this point. Okay, and then another thing that's really important to get published in international journals is to do the best study that you can. So an optimal study design and analysis to answer your study question. And that has to be given the resources and data available to you. So here, think about what you can do and what is realistic. You may actually need to sort of alter your study question a little bit to be something that you can answer with the information that you have. Now, these are issues that really need to be addressed when you're designing the study most of the time, not when you're writing the manuscript. But for example, what if you can only afford to do a study in a very small population? Well, if that's the case, you may be better off restricting the population to avoid confounding. So maybe you restrict it to a particular age group or to only women or only men or to a particular occupational group. You lose generalizability, but you may have a more valid study. So think strategically about what you really can do with the resources that you have. You may be better off addressing a very specific or narrow question if you can do that very well than trying to address a really big question but doing it poorly. And again, confirmatory studies. Ideally, your confirmation studies should be as good or better than previous studies so that people will be confident that your findings are real and not spurious. But again, highlight what is unique to your study as well. So even if you do a confirmatory study, what is it about your population that makes it special? Is there a particular aspect of susceptibility that you can really bring out? Avoid fatal flaws. I think I already mentioned these, but these are study design issues that you can't correct after the fact. So you can't fix it with your data analysis. And one of the most common things that we see are invalid comparison groups. So that you go out, so that your study population is a vague, convenient sample, or you're comparing one town with another town, where the one town is exposed and the other town isn't, but maybe the two towns are also different in terms of socioeconomic status or climate or something else. You also want to do, to the extent that you can, use up-to-date approaches to data analysis. This is very important, and here you may need some outside collaboration. But if you collaborate, then you can use more advanced approaches, but be very careful if you used advanced methods that you don't understand well. You need to understand the assumptions and models. This is a problem that's not at all specific to authors from Africa or anywhere else. The easier it becomes to use a particular software package, the more we see people running these models that they clearly don't understand. So this is as likely to happen for American authors as people anywhere else. You need to understand the assumptions and the models that you're using, and you need to convey your understanding when you describe the methods. That's it. So again, here's the first 5 people here are all on the call, and we'd all be happy to answer any questions that you have. And then I also wanted to mention Joel Kaufman, who is EHP's new editor-in-chief, and he is not on the call today, but he just started a couple months ago and will be increasingly important in helping to drive our outreach internationally. And there's more information about everyone here. You can use the link there. So that's the end of my slides, and I'd be happy to take questions.